Hello, I'm Mike Leahy, an ecologist with the Missouri Department of Conservation and our statewide resource management branch. In this presentation, we will cover in broad brushstrokes the basics of woodland natural community management. In another presentation, Susan Farrington will talk about glade natural community management, and together these will be a prerequisite before our field trip workshop of glade and woodland management later this month. We have 5 main points to cover. Glades, prairies, savannas, woodlands, and forests are distinct and important natural communities. Restored woodlands provide multiple biologic benefits. Identifying and prioritizing the highest priority restoration sites is critical for restoration success. Restoring and managing glades and woodlands requires multiple resource management tools and a cautious but consistent approach. Monitoring and evaluation tools are available to help measure restoration success. In Missouri, repeating patterns of native plants, animals, soils, geology, topography, regional climate, and hydrology are called natural communities. We have 9 major natural community groups, including prairies, savannas, woodlands, glades, forests, wetlands, cliffs, caves, and aquatic features, including rivers, streams, and springs. The hallmarks of a natural community include intact unplowed soils, habitat specialist species such as the prairie coreopsis and the coreopsis bee, functioning ecological processes such as fire or flooding and soil saturation, and a complexity of life forms and interactions such as pollination. To do natural community management within an adaptive management framework, you need to do 5 things. First, define and describe the natural communities that are your target. Select the best sites for restoration of those communities. Then you go ahead and implement the management practices. Monitor natural communities as the management occurs, and then reassess the effectiveness of your management actions. To reiterate, our terrestrial natural communities are defined by physiography, including landform, topographic position, aspect, and slope, regional climate patterns, soils, including the soil moisture regime, soil texture, the depth of the rooting zone, and the soil pH, geologic parent materials, and those ecological processes. So, for example, this mesoclus forest occurs on north and east facing slopes with deep lush soils in the river hills bordering the Missouri River in eastern Missouri. Dominant trees here include northern red oak, white oak, basswood, sugar maple, ash, and bittern hickory. The understory has pawpaw and spicebush. The ground cover is rich in ferns, and characteristic animals include the Kentucky warbler, pileated woodpecker, spicebush swallowtail, and spotted salamander. This is not a place for woodland management. This is what we consider a true forest natural community. So here I'll profile the broad groups of upland natural communities that are relevant to the discussion of woodland restoration and management. We'll start with upland forest, first example, where we find tall straight trees, including white northern red oak, ash, basswood, elms, maples, bitternut, and shagbark hickory. The forest floor is rich in spring ephemerals and ferns. There are shade-tolerant shrubs and small trees, including dogwoods, spicebush, pawpaw, and ironwood. These are usually found at north and east-facing slopes with rich soils and protected lower slopes. And in the summer, they have deep shade at the ground level. Opposite on the light gradient for forests are prairies. These are dominated by native grasses, wildflowers, and sedges, and have less than 10% tree cover. They have lots of species in the aster family. They're found on level, gently rolling terrain typically. They have full sunlight in the summer at ground level. They can have extremely high diversity of native plant species at a fine scale. Transitional between prairies and woodlands are savannas. These usually have short statured trees with wide spreading, often gnarled crowns, including post, chinkapin, fir, and black oaks and hickories. In between the trees and groups of trees, the ground is covered in thick prairie vegetation. Under the drip line of the trees are woodland forbs, sedges, and grasses. Found in rolling terrain in association with prairie and prairie openings. In the Ozarks, we have glades, which typically occur adjacent to woodlands. These are dominated by herbaceous plants and less than 10% tree cover. Soils are thin and rocky, and bedrock exposures are common. They typically occur on south and west slopes in the Ozarks as openings in the woods. In some cases, lichens and mosses dominate large areas of exposed rock. Some biologists consider these xeric prairies. Next, we have the topic of our presentation, and that are upland woodlands. So woodlands are typically fire-adapted or dry site forests in Missouri. They are characterized by short-stature trees with spreading, often gnarled crowns, including post, chinkapin, black, fir, and blackjack oaks and hickories, and shortleaf pine in parts of southeast Ozarks. The ground layer in the summertime is rich in wildflowers, as well as in the fall, and these also include sedges and native grasses. They have an open midstory with scattered sumac, oak, and hickory sprouts. They're found on south and west aspects with shallow and rocky soils and exposed slopes. And they have dappled sunlight in the summer at ground level. To really oversimplify, we can look at this diagram that shows the gradient between prairie and true forest communities based on the amount of canopy cover, as well as the amount of midstory and the cover on the ground layer. This diagram shows the relationship between basal area and tree density as communities change across the gradient from savanna to true forest. So as you go to forest, you increase, of course, in your basal area and the density of your trees. In the Ozarks, the most reliable sites to find good woodland restoration potential are typically associated with glades and shallow to bedrock areas. This diagram does a great job showing the gradient of glade and woodland natural communities going from a southwest aspect hill slope to a northeast aspect hill slope. This whole profile shown here would make a great glade and woodland management unit. And it shows the depth of the soil as well as the aspect. So as you go from the dry dolomite woodland, below the glade, then above the glade, you have shallow, cherty soils. And then on the north-facing aspect, you go down into a dry mesic site, which eventually at the base of the slope will transition to a forest. To understand woodlands in Missouri, you need to understand the legacy of tallgrass prairie in our state. This incomplete map shows most of the range of tallgrass prairie in the U.S. and is complete for Missouri at this scale. Note how prairie dominate large areas of the state, and even in the Ozarks, especially on the Springfield Plateau, prairies occurred. Over the past few thousand years, Missouri's climate has been wet enough such that in the absence of fire, grasslands grow up into trees. It is universally accepted that Missouri's tallgrass prairies were primarily fire-maintained over the past few centuries prior to statehood. These fires were primarily human-set by Native Americans and later early European settlers. However, during drought periods, lightning fires also occurred. Most historical references to Native American burning document their fires to have occurred in the fall during a time known colloquially as Indian Summer. This map, compiled by MU geographer James Harlan based on General Land Office survey notes, shows that much of Missouri's wooded uplands in the early 1800s were more akin to our concept of woodland and savanna natural communities, including large pine and oak woodlands in the lower Ozarks. Dendrochronology and fire history work by Rich Gayat and Mike Stambo of University of Missouri document fire scars in the wood of old-growth trees and ancient pine stumps. These fire scars only document the fires hot enough to create a wound. Fire intervals varied through time and space depending on climate patterns and human population densities in the early 19th century Ozarks. Guyot found in the Ozarks in Missouri the pre-settlement mean fire interval ranged from 3 to 13 years. This, of course, was for fires only hot enough to scar and wound trees. The actual interval may have been shorter. We have some historical descriptions of Missouri's oak woods and woodlands. First is by Henry Rowe Schoolcraft in 1819, writing about the uplands near the Merrimack River. He writes, a succession of hills of moderate elevation covered chiefly by oaks and without underbrush. A tall, thick, and rank growth of wild grass covers the whole country, in which the oaks are standing interspersed like fruit trees in some well-cultivated orchard, and giving to the scenery the most novel, pleasing, and picturesque appearance. Joseph Mudd in 1888 wrote about Lincoln County. When the county was first settled, there was no underbrush or small timber such as now exists. The timberlands were open, the trees standing so far apart that the hunters could see the deer at distances from 1 to 500 yards. The entire surface of the country was then covered with a rank growth of vegetation, consisting of the native grasses and wildflowers. Now let's examine the biological benefits of woodland restoration based on research. Research conducted by Calvin Maginel and others with MU and MDC at the Nature Conservancy's Chilton Creek site documented the results of annual and periodic prescribed fire on woodland sites along with control plots. This 16-year record shows that total ground floor cover increased 107% on annual and 144% on periodic fire plots and only 31% on control plots. These graphs from that same Chilton Creek study document the increase in cover of native grasses, forbs, and legumes on the annual and periodic burn units in comparison to the control. In particular, native legumes tend to thrive under a prescribed fire regime. This graph from the study demonstrates the increase in the mean coefficient of conservatism of plant species in the burn units. This metric is a measure of the number of remnant-dependent characteristic woodland plant species found per plot. This figure from Dan Dries with the Ozark National Scenic Riverways shows that after 5 burns, the dry woodland plots increased in native herbaceous species richness by 181%. In this other figure from Dan, he demonstrates a 460% increase in the average native herbaceous cover of dry woodland plots and an increase of 235% in the more dry mesic, or what he calls moist woodland plots. This photo from Dan shows a glade woodland edge prior to treatment on the Ozark National Scenic Riverways. Here is that same glade woodland edge after cedar thinning and 2 prescribed fires. You can see the herbaceous response and all the flowering that occurred the season after a fire. Woodland restoration restores a diverse and abundant ground flora, as we've seen, including many blooming forbs in the aster and legume plant families. This in turn provides nectar and pollen resources for native insects. Research has shown that woodland restoration assists with native bee conservation, which as a group is a declining faunal group. Woodland restoration promotes the ground flora, which in turn has been shown to provide abundant insects, such as these grasshoppers, that in turn provide the primary food base for turkey poults, as well as northern bobwhite poults too. These images contrast 2 different sides of the same location on a field road, the Western Star Flatwood site on the Mark Twain National Forest. To the left is the restored woodland with a lush ground cover, and to the right is an unrestored woodland with a heavy leaf litter ground cover. The restored woodlands had 5 prescribed burns and a moderate thinning. Which area would you predict turkey and quail would prefer? Next, let's consider the case of the collared lizard population at Steegle Mountain Natural Area on Peck Ranch Conservation Area. This species of conservation concern was introduced into the igneous glade system here between 1984 and 1989. Alan Templeton, a now retired professor at Washington University in St. Louis, studied this population for many years. What he found at first is the collared lizard population grew slow. This is before prescribed burns were implemented on the site. But once prescribed fire was applied to the mosaic of glades and woodlands, starting in the mid-90s, the lizards were able to steadily increase their population. The restored woodlands provided greater visibility, sunlight, and a greater prey base of grasshoppers, all of which combined to benefit the lizard. And in fact, in the burned woodlands versus the unburned, the burned woodlands had 11 times greater abundance of grasshoppers than in the unburned. The Central Hardwoods joint venture and the American Bird Conservancy have identified conservation priority bird species that utilize restored woodlands. And these birds include the eastern wood pewee, blue-gray gnatcatcher, red-headed woodpecker, yellow-billed cuckoo, and the eastern whippoorwill. Now we'll cover woodland restoration site selection techniques. It's important to identify the best and most practical sites for restoration. South and west facing slopes, steep and rocky ground, rocky ridges or ridges with soil fragipans or clay pans. Droughty soils and sites associated with glades may be poor for timber production, but are ideal for woodland restoration. Aerial imagery and topographic maps overlain with other data layers in ArcGIS, are powerful tools to develop initial set of restoration sites to then ground truth for woodland restoration potential. In this example here from Indian Trail Conservation Area, we can see that there's a restored glade and a burn unit to the right, an unrestored glade in the unit to the left, and then on private land, there's a very cedar filled glade that you can see. It's right about in here. So typically, these woods in and around glades, such as shown here at Steagle Mountain, typically respond the quickest to prescribed fire and thinning. There is a Missouri glade layer available to use in GIS that is a handy tool to identify potential glade and woodland sites. The Missouri Natural Heritage Database is another great source of data for glade and woodland restoration sites. Work with your local natural history biologist in MDC or natural resource ecologist in DNR to assist you in properly using and interpreting the Natural Heritage Database data and that glade layer data. This map shows a hypothetical 400-acre management compartment at Lead Mine Conservation Area. In this ArcGIS map, we have the natural glades layer in green and the ecological sites layer in dark gray. Ecological sites were developed by NRCS, MDC, and DNR in Missouri based on soils, hydrology, and pre-settlement vegetation patterns. They tell you the potential natural community type for a site, but you need to ground truth those. They don't tell you the current condition. This shows the extent of woodland ecological sites on this management compartment. As you notice, the compartment is mainly dominated by woodlands, except for the north to east facing aspects, which are more dry mesic sites that can support forest communities. But again, these are not real mesic forests. These are on the dry side of what we typically consider a true forest community. One last source of map data that can be useful in delineating woodland and glade restoration units are historic aerial photos. The old Soil Conservation Service, now NRCS, took aerial photos across the state in the 30s and 50s. And some NRCS offices still have these. However, these are available digitally from the State Historical Society of Missouri at the website shown here. And they can be a handy tool, such as in this case, at Avas Natural Area, you can see the old picture from 1941 shows lots of open glades. You can still see some glade openings in 2005, but you can see the extent of those opening glades in the 40s. You can also see where old fields are that today maybe have grown back into woods. Those tend to be areas, those old fields that have grown back into woods tend not to be your best restoration sites because of that past soil disturbance. So once you're on the site, you'll want to keep an eye out for plants that are indicative of good woodland restoration. We'll cover some of these in the field. Your local natural history biologist or natural resource ecologist can help you with identifying these. These species need a certain amount of sunlight to bloom, so often the only blooming specimens will be along roadsides and in openings prior to any restoration work. Oftentimes, these indicator species will be barely hanging on vegetatively in the shaded leaf litter of degraded woodland sites. The presence of multiple and frequent ground flora plant indicator species can indicate a good potential for restoration. On the flip side, you'll want to avoid sites that contain more than small infestations of non-native invasive species, such as these bad guys. Relict old growth and open grown gnarled oaks, especially post, chinkapin, bur, and white oaks, and pines in some places, can indicate past woodland conditions. Surrounding the oaks may be a dense layer of younger oaks, hickories, and cedars, and in some cases, winged elm. You also want to consider the logistics of carrying out multiple prescribed fires on a site before selecting which sites to restore. If the logistics of a prescribed burn are too daunting on a site, you may want to reassess. It would be better to commit to managing a unit that is feasible to treat with repeated prescribed burns every 2 to 3 years than to try and restore a site that might only get burned every 5+ years. Having a network of trails and roads that can be reliable fire lines make for much more logistically practical sites than places where you have to put in lots of hand line. Structural targets in woodland restorations can be developed based on metrics developed in forestry. Gathering tree overstory data from plots or prism cruises can be used to determine stand basal area, stem density, percent stocking, and an estimate of canopy cover. The following set of slides come from John Kubrick with the Forest Service. Stocking is an indication of tree growing space occupancy. To determine stocking of an oak hickory stand, you need to have an estimate of basal area per acre and trees per acre. The standard Gingrich stocking chart is used. Stocking in mature forests is usually above the B line and below the A line. Stocking in woodlands can range from 30 to 75%. It's a pretty broad range. Closed woodlands are typically maintained above the B line. Open woodlands are below the B line, and savannas are less than 30% stocking. Stand dynamics. In these photos, you can see on the top a 60% stock stand 5 years after thinning. Fairly open understory. And then below, you can see a 30% stocking stand 5 years after thinning with a reducing stand density increases sprouting, which can be an issue in management. This occurs more rapidly with increasing site quality. To reduce woody sprout density, consider these: increasing the prescribed burn rate and looking at more burns in the fall, using herbicides and cut stump treatments and hack and squirt, maintaining higher overstory stocking to control woody sprouts. And the bottom line is be cautious and don't open up a stand too quickly, because we've seen way too many examples where people get a little impatient and overly thin and then end up with sprout jungle. To stimulate ground floor recovery, you need to increase the available light in the understory and reduce the litter and duff layer. So opening up that midstory or understory is often the first step and is more important than worrying about the overstory at least for starters. There are a variety of different management objectives that can be written for woodland restoration in a restoration plan. These include controlling invasive species, reducing the midstory or understory stem density of saplings, invasive shrubs, and our pole-sized stems, reducing the litter and duff layer, stimulating native plant flowering and growth, enhancing the germination and regeneration of native herbaceous species, providing for oak and or pine regeneration and recruitment, reducing canopy gaps, reducing fuel loading and fire hazards, reducing vegetation structure and composition desirable for wildlife, and providing for the life history needs of species of conservation concern. Prescribed fire is the most important management tool for restoration, but there are many other tools in the toolbox that sometimes have to be used. These include thinning trees, both commercially and non-commercially, targeted herbicide use, and not very often, but sometimes supplemental seeding is needed. Fire regimes are complex and have have many variables. So we have frequency, the burn's annual every 3 years, the intensity, how many BTUs are released in the burn, duration, is it a slow moving backing fire or fast moving head fire, the size of the burned area, the season, the variability, and the burn pattern. Is the burn area uniformly blackened, or is there a patchwork of burned and unburned fuels? So there's many different prescribed fire variables to take into account. MDC has developed some general guidelines for the use of prescribed fire. Each site situation, of course, is specific. And the most important thing is a trained and experienced burn crew with staff-trained state, federal, wildland firefighting qualifications. These guidelines that follow come from George Hartman's MDC publication, Use of Prescribed Fire. Again, these are broad brushstrokes. In the restoration phase, you want to burn every 1 to 3 years. Most sites are still in the restoration phase. This takes a decade or more. Once you're in the maintenance phase, which can be after 20 years of burning, you can burn every 4 to 6 years to maintain vigor in the herbaceous layer and control woody invasion in the maintenance phase. Dormant season and early spring burns are typically used during the restoration phase. Once desired structural conditions are met, late summer through fall burns promote more forb diversity and abundance and may assist with sumac control. If thinning has been done, let the woody debris cure for over 6 months. With heavy slash, especially cedar slash, you may want to burn piles in the winter months. Try to minimize any tops or fuel jackpots close to your residual leaf trees. Flame lengths of 1 to 2 feet will maintain the herbaceous layer and top kill woody stems with a basal diameter under an inch. Flame lengths of 3 to 5 feet will top kill woody stems with a basal diameter up to 4 to 5 inches. Flame lengths over 5 feet can kill overstory trees, and that's usually not what we want. Weather and fuel moisture condition ranges, eye level wind speeds of 3 to 8 miles per hour, temperatures 40 to 70, relative humidity 30 to 50%. Again, plus or minus 1 hour fuel moisture 6 to 9%, 10-hour fuel moisture 7 to 10, 100-hour fuel moisture 13 to 17, and 1,000 hours greater than 18. Those are kind of ideal conditions. There's a lot of considerations when designing a burn unit. You're going to look at your primary and secondary burn lines, fuel loading, terrain, proximity of infrastructure, slope, the different fuel models and behave, smoke management concerns, and the abundance of snags near the burn lines and any other hazards. Cutting and treating stumps or hack and squirt thinning using approved herbicides is an effective method in combination with prescribed fire to open up the understory without excessive woody sprouting. But it can be very labor intensive and costly, but it is the best way to restore a woodland if you have that option. These before and after slides illustrate the results of 20 years of glade and woodland restoration at Steegle Mountain National Area. Restoration was initiated in 1996, and in 2017, photo stations were revisited. Here's a 1996 view. Here's the same view, 2017, 96, 2017. So you can see that with sustained management come good results. We have a number of management lessons too that we've learned that we'll hopefully see in the field. The above photo shows the Pine Oak Woodland Unit 1 in 2012 at Rocky Creek Conservation Area in Shannon County, after 3 burns and firewood cutting thinnings. Note the larger leaning pine on the left. This unit was burned 3 times and had that firewood thinning. and then it was not burned for another decade. And here we see the results of not doing that. After releasing woody sprouts and not following up with prescribed fire, you end up with a thick midstory and a diminished ground floor. And this is going to take a lot of work and effort to restore. So the lesson here is that if you commit to woodland restoration, you need to keep up with the burn cycle. Otherwise, you shouldn't even start a project. Here we see photos taken by Susan Farrington of a dolomite woodland in Shannon County. They had a ton of cedar slash on it. It was cut in the winter of 2020/2021. It was then burned on March 21st, 2021 under hot conditions. About 10 acres of overstory trees were killed. And you can see we have some pretty severe fire effects due to the hot conditions of the fire and the combination of cedar slash. So this is something we really don't want to do if we can get away with it. After the fire, areas that had heavy cedar slash and burned hot are now dominated by weedy species like pokeweed, mullein, and woodland general species like woodland sunflower. The heavy cedar slash field loads need special treatments to avoid these results. Here's another picture showing the results of a hot fire with heavy cedar slash. Again, this can be very problematic, and unless those piles are burned during more cool conditions in the wintertime, you're going to end up with issues like this. This photo documents a heavy understory layer of woody resprouts after a recent prescribed burn. This is one of our toughest problems, is creating these woody resprout jungles. If you open up the canopy too quickly, you get a lot of sprouting, or with a hot fire, especially hot spring fires, and that becomes a management issue. Wing sumac can be particularly problematic, and again, it can be an issue with opening up the canopy too quickly and burning too hot. This photo demonstrates what can happen in a low-quality woodland site that was thinned and burned and then let go for several years. And in this case, we've got a lot of blackberry and rubus species, sassafras, black cherry, and sumac. And this is going to be a real mess to try to restore. So again, be cautious, slow, and consistent with woodland restoration. Here we'll quickly take a visual tour of some high-quality woodland sites to leave you with a mental image of desired future conditions. This ranges from Caney Mountain Natural Area, Ahatonka Woodland Natural Area, Danville Glades Natural Area, Sheldon Creek Site, and Steagle Mountain. Questions will be answered in the field, and we'll have good discussions there to look at woodland restoration potential, as well as some management conundrums, and custom discuss different solutions to those problems.